Okay, so we'll cover more on the 1920s here, and with the identifications three and four. This would be first ID is on Ernest Hemingway, the famous writer, and then the second one is the famous uh, building that was built in New York in the late 20s and early 30s called the Empire State Building. So first, let's start with Hemingway. Okay, so Ernest Hemingway, who would become one of the most famous of all American writers. But first, let's start with the time period. He was born in 1899 and died in 1961. So that's 1899 to 1961. When he was in his younger years, uh, he actually served in World War One, and World War One affects so much of the people that we'll be talking about in the near future. So he lived through World War One as an ambulance driver, and and was at the front as an ambulance driver, experiencing lots of hardships of the war, which right now medical personnel is so much in the news with what's currently going on in the United States with the virus. But Hemingway was an ambulance driver during World War One, and so he was right up by the front. After the war, and he did receive a number of bad injuries during his period as an ambulance driver, but he survived the war and certainly affected who he became. And so after the war, he went into writing, and he became a famous writer. And he was from these writers after World War One. There was a group, they were kind of they knew each other, some of them, and they wrote very um, striking and interesting books, and they were given the nickname the Lost Generation um, right after World War One. And he was probably the most famous of all the writers of the Lost Generation. And he wrote a number of famous books, certainly influences by his years as an ambulance driver in World War One. I mean, just quickly, I mean, we see the kind of ambulances that were around in World War One. This is a Ford uh, who had just recently, remember we covered it before the exam, um, had invented, or at least invented, modern and assembly line procedures, and was selling the famous cars, the Model T. But look, you can see here Ford helped build ambulances. And so, see, here's another picture of ambulance on the front in World War One. There's quite a few interesting pictures on the internet concerning medical corps in World War One. Here's another picture of Ernest Hemingway, who as wasn't just a writer. He traveled around the world. He was known as an adventurer. He was involved in many different things. And here he volunteered for the to fight with the Spanish revolutionaries during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. And he was doing this simultaneously, and in between things like this, he would write books. And he was part of this lost generation of writers who, some of the other writers actually volunteered also to fight against Franco's military forces in Spain in 1930. And here he is. He had spent some time fighting in the Spanish Civil War. And that help was very much appreciated by those fighting during the revolution, the unsuccessful revolution against the dictatorship in Spain. And here's just a slide of some of the fighters in the Spanish War, and Civil War in the 1930s that Hemingway was volunteering um, to fight alongside. We see, obviously, these women are fighting for on the revolutionary side during the Spanish Civil War. Uh, okay, so after that period of time, Ernest Hemingway, when that war was over, went back to. So one of Hemingway's famous books was The Sun Also Rises, which was later made into a movie, and it was a very famous book. He wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls and quite a few other well-known books. He was a famous world traveler, like I said, adventure. He met with other writers, including F. Scott Fitzgerald, another famous writer there. F. Scott Fitzgerald was also a member of the Lost Generation. You might know him from The Great Gatsby, Tender is the Night, who lived during that era and lived in France for a while until he died from alcoholism. But Hemingway was perhaps the most famous of the writers. Um, and like I said, he was born in 1899, died in 1961 of suicide after his bad health problems. Uh, and there are still monuments and landmarks to him in the Chicago area because he was born in Oak Park, Illinois. Okay, the Empire State Building. Okay, so the next lecture, and this idea is on the Empire State Building, which was completed in 1931. It was quickly built and in this era, in the late 20s, um, but it was built. You can see people working at great heights. It was built in completion. It was 102 floors tall, almost 1,500 feet high. So the Empire State Building was the tallest building in the world when it was completed in 1931 and remained that way for many decades. The World Trade Center was built higher than the Empire State Building, but that was all the way till 1972. So until September 11th, 2001, the World Trade Center was the tallest building. Um, so, but again, after that attack, the Empire State Building became the tallest building again in New York. So, one thing about the Empire State Building when it was built in 19 and finished in 1931 was that it would become a broadcast center for radio that could broadcast from the roof and reach faraway areas for radio. And radio was was going to be becoming would become a huge form of communication and entertainment for news and for music. And the Empire State Building was where these first radio broadcasts were coming from. And then later, even television stations would broadcast from the top of the Empire State Building. So it's still one of the most famous buildings in the world.